voice is as beautiful as ever. As I was anticipating what to go over for Mother's Day, I wanted to highlight a mother in the Bible. And, after thinking just a little bit, this came to my mind. And I love the detail that's in this. Well, I shouldn't say detail. There's not a whole lot of detail. The scripture that, make sure they get settled okay. The scripture that John read through this morning, there's a lot contained in that that's not actually written. And I thought I want to go through that and look at some of the details and think about some of the things that were in here. So it says here, if this is in 2 Kings chapter 4, starting in verse 8, and it said, "And fell on a day that Elisha passed to Shunem, where was a great woman." Now Shunem is in the northern part of Israel. It's just southeast of Nazareth. Now in our story, well, I won't say that yet. She travels to Mount Carmel, and I'll get into distances on that. But where it says that she was a woman from Shunem, in this village of Shunem, I looked at that actually this morning, and Shunem is still on the map today. So it's interesting, and it's not, you'd think after thousands of years that it just expanded into a large city. It's not all that big. I didn't look up the population, but it's still somewhat of a small town. And it says, "Where was a great woman." I looked up some commentaries, a definition of what a great woman is, and it's very general. She could be considered a great woman because of her age. It could have been because of her political influence in the town. It could have been because of her financial status with her husband. It doesn't actually tell us. But as we go through this, I want you to think about what would you think makes her a great woman, as defined, as mentioned here. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through here. And it says, and she constrained him. Well, it says, "Where was a great woman, and she constrained him to eat bread." This is for Elisha. "And it was so that as often as he passed by, he turned in there to eat bread." Now, there's so many different stories in the Bible where they didn't go to a hotel and have hotels in all these towns. People put people up into their homes. They'd see someone in the town and invite them in. Some of them, I look back at Elisha in a situation very similar to this, and he was lodged in an upper room in an attic area. So, but the Shunammite here, she decided, and that's another thing here we're going to see as we go through here, there's no specific name given to her. She was considered the Shunammite. Now, I don't know why that is, but you'll see all the way through here, she was considered the woman from Shuna, or the Shunammite. But she saw the need here with Elisha, and she provided food for him, and then lodging. And it says, verse 9, "And she said unto her husband, Behold now, I perceive that this is a holy man of God, who passeth by us regularly." So this went on for a while, and she understood, and she defined him as a holy man of God. She says, "Let us make a little chamber, I pray thee, with walls, and let us set for him there a bed, and a table, and a stool, and a lampstand, and it shall be, when he cometh to us, that he shall turn in here." And it fell on a day, he came there, and he turned unto the chamber, and lay there. And he said to Gehazi, his servant, "Call this Shunammite." And when he had called her, she stood before him. And he said unto him, notice here, it's strange that it doesn't seem like he's talking directly to her. It's Gehazi. But it said she came to the room. I thought, well, was she speaking a different language? Why was it always going through Gehazi, his servant? It doesn't tell us exactly why, but he was using his servant to communicate. Now, a little bit later, he talks directly to her. But it says, and when he called her, she stood before him. And he said unto him, say now unto her, behold, thou hast shown care for us with all this care. What is to be done for thee? Wouldest thou be spoken for to the king or to the captain of the host? And she answered, I dwell among my own people. Now, as far as starting to eliminate some of the things when it says she's a great woman, if she was famous as far as kind of a political leader in her town and she had influence, the first thing that Elisha mentioned was, would you want me to mention you before the king or before the captain of the host, the general? She didn't want recognition in anything. She was humble. That's something we can see about her. She was happy with her state in life. I dwell among my people. And he said, what then is to be done for her? So after apparently she left the room or near the door there, Gehazi and Elisha were talking. What's to be done for her? And Gehazi answered, verily she hath no child, and her husband is old. So in those details, it would seem as if the husband is older and she's younger, whether she's a young woman or middle-aged. But just Gehazi's response is the likelihood of her having a baby through her husband, who's pretty much a lot older, was very unlikely. And for any woman in Israel, it was devastating to be barren, not to be able to have a child. And Gehazi saw what was there, and he mentioned that to Elisha. And in verse 15, and he said, call her. And when he had called her, she stood in the door. And he said, about this season, when the time cometh, or it's in the King James, it says, according to the time of life, thou shalt embrace a son. And she said, nay, my Lord, thou man of God, do not lie unto thy handmaid. Now, she wasn't saying, no, I don't want a child. She was saying, don't get my hopes up. Don't lie to me. Because, it doesn't explain a whole lot more, but just imagine what it would be like for a woman, for someone she has wanted for a long time. And I would imagine she prayed before the Lord. We remember the story of Hannah, who cried before the Lord for a son or a child, and she wound up having Samuel, but she just cried out in anguish because of what she was going through. Now, it doesn't tell us that this woman was asking before the Lord. I really believe she was, because of the state that she was in, and every woman wanted to have a child. But she says, nay, my Lord, thou man of God, do not lie unto thy handmaid. She just didn't want her hopes to be built up. And it doesn't go any further than that. And then you hear in verse 17, and the woman conceived and bore a son at that season that Elisha had said unto her, according to the set time. Now we just have to imagine, what was it like for her to hear that? And she heard from him, or she said, don't get my hopes up. There was no more conversation in there. But then she finds out she's pregnant. Can you imagine the excitement that she must have experienced feeling movement for the first time? Or they didn't have the pregnancy test back then. They had to wait until they had the physical signs of it all. But she had a child. There must have been such excitement that she had. As I sat, I took all week reading this over and thinking about the different emotions and stuff they would have gone through. I can't imagine what it's like for a woman. I don't know how it affects your mind, your emotions, your thinking, because I've never been through that before. And yet I know that it affects every part of your mind, your being. But to have that kind of excitement and thrill to have a child, a hope that this woman has had ever since she was probably a young girl, and now she's having a child. And she had a son. Just the way a mother nourishes or cares for a son or a child, there's the feeding, there's the. I think about my daughter who just adopted in January, and I see pictures. I was out there a couple times, that a few weeks ago, and then she'll send me pictures, and my heart just melts because this baby's everything, the ears, the lips, everything is so perfect. And even though it's an adopted baby, that's our family. It's just so exciting, the feelings. And they'll send me a picture, and I think, how exciting. I wish I could be on the fun. But then I think, my daughter is not always fun. When I hear about the blowouts with the diaper, and they have to handle all that, the throw up, the nights where they have to get up in the middle of the night, it's not as fun. I get to look at a picture and I think how exciting that is. But a mother handles all those things, and her heart is connected no matter what. Is the baby breathing right? Is the baby sleeping right? All the different things. She experienced all that. And she had a baby. Now look where it goes to in the next verse here. And when the child was grown, it fell on a day that he went out to his father to the reapers. And he said unto his father, my head. And he said to a lad, one of the helpers reaping, carry him to his mother. Now, I'll go a little bit further here to pick up some of the details here. And when he had taken him and brought him to his mother, he sat on her knees till noon and then died. Wow. There is so much in here that you have to look at the details. How old was he? It says when he was grown. Well, how old was he? And I thought if he was 1 or 2, he wouldn't go stumbling out into the field to his father. And yet he sat, when the servant took the child to the mother, he sat on her knee. So my guess is anywhere from 4 to maybe 8 years old. Beyond 8 years old, it's not as common to sit on mom's knee or her lap. So somewhere in that age is how old this little child was. And he had something going on in his head. It was a commentary I read, and it said it's possibly heat stroke. I don't know about that. It could have been a tumor. It could have been any type of disease, but it was a head pain that he had. And the father told the servant, take him to his mom. And the mother sat with him on her knees until noon, which whatever time, several hours, and he died. If you can just imagine the pain that mother went through, this child which was a miracle child from God, just died on her knees. Look what she does next. Verse 21, and she went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God and shut the door upon him and went out. And she called unto her husband and said, send me, I pray thee, one of the young men and one of the asses or the donkeys, that I may run to the man of God and come again. And he, the husband, said, wherefore wilt thou go unto him today? It is neither new moon nor Sabbath. And she said, it shall be well. It's okay. Let's fill in the blanks on that. I wonder why the husband wasn't more engaged in this. We don't know. It doesn't tell us. There may be a lot more in this as far as he was a good father. But the child dies. She doesn't take him to his own room and lay him there. She doesn't take him to her room and lay him on the bed. she takes him to the man of God and puts him on his bed, shuts the door. So it's clear he's dead. It's not a matter of him sick, he's unconscious, or she wouldn't have left him. And then she goes quickly to her husband and says she wants to go to this man of God. That's 23. And he said, "Wherefore wilt thou go today? It is neither new moon nor Sabbath." And she said, "It shall be well." Apparently, this man traveled in a circuit between the different cities and towns, doing feasts, doing the different things that a priest would do or a prophet. And it was not the time that he would normally be there. So it's possible that the mother did not tell her husband what actually happened. She just said, "I want to go run to this man." And he didn't understand. And he said, "Well, why would you go now?" It's possible that if she said to him, "The child's dead," that everything would have stopped, and it would have stopped her from where she wanted to go, her purpose and all. So she just said, "I want to go." And then he came up with the idea, well, it's not the time. He's not around these areas. She said, "It'll be okay." Then she saddled an ass and said to her servant, "Drive and go forward. Slacken not thy riding for me, except I bid thee." Now, I mentioned last week that I had a horse. I pick up on some of the details here, and it says, "And she saddled a donkey and said to the servant, 'Drive.'" Now, if she saddled the donkey, you picture someone throwing a saddle. Now, how's the servant and the woman going to ride the same donkey? That's possibly what happened. But she says, "And go forward, slack not thy riding for me, except I bid thee." Now, I thought it's possible that they harnessed a donkey and pulled a cart. Either way, whether she's riding on a horse or a donkey or a cart, you can only imagine how bumpy that ride is. But she said, "Go on, go fast, and drive. Don't worry about me." And she would just hang on and do whatever's necessary to get there. 25, so she went and came unto the man of God to Mount Carmel. Now, this is where I looked at where Shunem is to Mount Carmel, and it's about 25 miles. If we're driving in the car, it could take you, I clocked it from here down to the international airport, and that's about anywhere from 25 to 28 miles. It would take us about 20 minutes, pretty much, no traffic, to get from here down to the airport. For them riding on donkey, it would take them more than a day. Now, if they're moving fast, for a donkey, it's not going to run like a horse would. It probably took a little bit more than a day. Now, we know from the details it's already afternoon time, so she possibly rode through the night just to get there to Elisha. But just to see her determination and what her purpose was, she just kept pushing through because of her son dead. And it came to pass when the man of God saw her afar off that he said to Gehazi, his servant, "Behold, over there is that Shunammite. Run now, I pray thee, and meet her, and say unto her, Is it well with thee? Is it well with thy husband? Is it well with the child?" And she answered, "It is well." Well, it isn't well. His son is dead. But from where Elisha was, whatever the distance was, he could see her and identified her and told his servant, "Go find out what's up." She did not want to talk to the servant. She wanted to talk to Elisha. She says, "It's okay." Because if she stood there and talked to the servant, it's just going to waste time. She wanted to get to Elisha as quick as possible. And when she came to the man of God, to the hill, she caught him by the feet. But Gehazi came near to thrust her away. But the man of God said, "Let her alone, for her soul is bitter within her, and the Lord hath hidden it from me and hath not told me." There's many times in Scripture where God instructed a prophet of what was going to happen and what to do next. But here, God didn't say anything to Elisha, and this was all new to him. He didn't know anything about it. And he could see that she wasn't just trying to come and get something from him or assault him. She was distraught over something that happened. So he kept Gehazi from doing anything. 28, then she said, did I desire a son of my Lord? Did I not say, do not deceive me? Now she's saying to Elisha, back when she first answered, that she said, nay, my Lord, thou man of God, do not lie unto thy handmaid. She didn't want her hopes to be built up. Now she's in a situation where this miracle child that she had hoped for, now she got, is now dead. It just makes no sense. Even when we think about it, why would God allow this woman to go through the thrill, the excitement of having a child, to then the baby to die like this? So she says, did I desire a son of my Lord? In other words, she didn't come to Elijah and say, would you please grant me, talk to the Lord and grant me a child that I could have a child. I believe her prayers were before the Lord. And it was the Lord, that through Gehazi then, this woman doesn't have a child. And then Elisha moved forward and blessed her through this. Did I not say, do not deceive me? She was so distraught that she's feeling it would have been better not to have a child than to have a child and then to experience him dying like this. 29 says, then he said to Gehazi, gird up thy loins and take thy staff in thine hand and go thy way. If thou meet any man, greet him not, and if any greet thee, answer him not again, and lay my staff upon the face of the child. So Elisha instructed Gehazi, take my staff. And God has worked through different things with the Moses staff, that when he raised it up and the waters were parted and different things. Elisha figured this might work, just feeling that this was on his heart. And he sent Gehazi with haste. Don't stop and talk to anyone. If anyone talks to you, just ignore them and go as quickly as possible to this child. Now in verse 30, the mother of the child said, as the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, I will not leave thee. And he arose and followed her. Now, the woman I don't know if Elisha was determining that he was going to stay where he was, take my staff and put it on the child's face, and this would raise the child. The mother could have run with Gehazi to get back to the child as quick as possible just to be with the child. She said to Elisha, I'm not leaving your side. As the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, I will not leave thee. Something interesting, if you go back a couple pages to chapter 2, verse 2, this is the scenario that's happening here is when Elijah was fired from his job because he wasn't trusting God. Ahab's wife was chasing him and said, I'm going to kill you. He was running from God. He wasn't willing to stand up and trust God for his protection. That's another story. But Elisha then was tapped to be the replacement of Elijah. And here in chapter 2, verse 2, they came to an area from Gilgal. I'll start in verse 1. And it came to pass when the Lord would take up Elijah unto heaven by a whirlwind, that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal. And Elisha said to Elisha, tarry here, I pray thee, for the Lord hath sent me to Bethel. And Elisha said unto him, as the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, I will not leave thee. So they went down to Bethel. So Elisha was saying to Elijah, I'm not leaving your side. Whatever you go through, I'm going to be by your side. And it's interesting, this is the same thing that this woman, she wasn't there at that time with Elijah and Elisha, but she said, I'm going to stay by your side. Wherever you go, that's where I'm going. I think that's what stirred Elisha to jump up at that point, and we got to go. Verse 31, and Gehazi passed on before them and laid the staff upon the face of the child, but there was neither voice nor hearing, wherefore he went again to meet him and told him, saying, the child was not awakened. And when Elisha was come into the house, behold, the child was dead and lay upon the bed. So Elisha and the woman were apparently on their way, not running as quick or riding as quick as Gehazi was, but Gehazi got there, put the staff on the baby's face, and nothing happened. So Elisha arrived there at the house. He went in, therefore, in verse 33, and shut the door upon the two of them and prayed unto the Lord. And he went up and lay upon the child and put his mouth upon his mouth and his eyes upon his eyes and his hands upon his hands. And he stretched himself upon the child, and the flesh of the child became warm. Then he returned and walked in the house to and fro, and went up and stretched upon himself upon him, and the child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. The scripture was clear. This child was dead. You know, I've seen some videos where they pulled in a man that was overboard on a ship. And some of the people, or one of the men on the ship, would actually lay on top of this person and hug them. And the warmth of this person would surround and give that warmth to that person and revive them. They weren't dead. It just brought warmth. That's not the case here. This child was dead, and God waited until Elisha was there to be able to perform this miracle through Elisha. And he called Gehazi and said, call this Shunammite. So he called her, and when she was come in unto him, he said, take up thy son. Then she went in and fell at his feet and bowed herself to the ground and took up her son and went out. Again, you have to fill in all the emotions. Can you imagine the excitement of knowing that her boy was dead? And Elisha brought him back to life. You think back, why did she take him up into the room and put him in Elisha's room? Why not keep him in his room? He's dead. She could have contacted her husband. We're going to make funeral arrangements. She knew she had to get to Elisha. This is where I believe when it says she was a great woman. She was a great woman of faith because she knew she had to get to Elisha. She left the boy that was dead in the room, specifically taking him up into Elisha's room, and ran to go get Elisha. I'm going to stay with Elisha. I don't believe she was holding him up as an idol or worshiping Elisha, but she knew that God worked through Elisha. She had faith in God and that she wanted to go, and she was pleading then to God through Elisha. And she came, and you know, when you think about it, why would she run all that distance when her boy is dead at home? All along, she had hope in her heart that Elisha could raise him from the dead. Why else? She didn't go to get him so he could be a part of the funeral. She knew that Elisha could do something. God was able and capable of doing something through Elisha. Now, at that point, the story is over in verse 37. What's so interesting is, just to fill you in a little bit before we go to chapter 8 and pick up the story, Gehazi was the servant, as we know, of Elisha. I think many of us know the story of Naaman. Naaman was it says here in verse 1 of chapter 5, and Naaman, captain of the host of the king of Syria, was a great man. Now here, she was a great woman, the Shunammite. Now this man's called a great man, but for different purposes. Now it's because of the position, the political position that he had. And it talked out he was a man of valor, and he was a great man, but he had leprosy. And in their battles against Israel, they took a servant girl. And this servant girl was servant to Naaman's wife. And the young girl said, it says right here in verse 3, and she said unto her mistress, this is a young girl, would to God my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria, for he would cure him of his leprosy. That word of this girl saying that got to the king. The king, apparently Naaman was right there as this was being said. The king said, I'm going to send Naaman and donkeys and mules loaded with gold and silver and raiment, a lot of provisions, and go to the king of Israel. This was Jehoram at the time. And so he sent him. Jehoram got the letter, and it said, I've sent my servant to be healed by you. Jehoram said, who am I to heal anyone? And he figured it's some type of a move of the king of Syria to come and defeat Israel. It says he tore his clothes in anguish, and Elisha found out about it. And he said, what? Why has the king torn his clothes? And it was told then that it's because Naaman was coming. He said, send him to me. So Elisha says, send him to me. He came to Elisha's house, and he was outside the gate. Elisha sent Gehazi out to talk with him and found out that he has leprosy. And Elisha said, well, go tell him to wash in the Jordan River 7 times. Naaman got so angry that he was furious because of his stature of who he was. He was so angry that Elisha wouldn't come out and talk to him personally. And he said, I thought he would have called upon his God and clapped his hands over the place and made some big show and healed him. And he said, and he tells me to go wash in the Jordan River. He said, there's rivers in Syria that are much cleaner and nicer than the River Jordan. So he stormed off. He turned around and he started to walk away. And his servant said to him, wait a minute. If Elisha told you to do some great feat, some great thing, wouldn't you have done it? And he thought about it. He said, yeah. So he convinced him, his own servant convinced him, go down to the Jordan River. And I looked at that distance too. It was possibly 1 or 2 miles away. So he went down to the Jordan River. He washed 7 times, as it was told. And he came away, and it says his skin was clean. He was healed. It was like the skin of a child. He came back to Elisha, and he was ready to give him all the gold and the silver and everything. And Elisha said, I don't want any of that stuff. I don't want any. And Naaman tried to keep pushing it, but he wouldn't take it. So the man leaves. Gehazi thought, oh, I could set up my future here. So the scripture explains, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, and Gehazi then snuck out of the house and went after Naaman and his caravan that he had. And he said, hey, hold on there. Elisha just had a couple prophets come in. And, do you have some stuff you could spare for these 2 prophets that came? And he said, sure. He said, how much do you want? And he gave him a mule loaded. And some of Naaman's servants went back with Gehazi. And when they got close, it says that Gehazi took the stuff and went and hid it in the house. Elisha came to him and said, where were you, Gehazi? He says, oh, I'm just hanging around, nowhere. And he said, my heart went with you. I know what you did. And he called him out on it. He said, this is not a time to enrich ourselves. He said, now the leprosy that was on Naaman is going to cling to you. And it said he became a leprous that very moment, as white as snow. So at that time, Gehazi was fired. Now in between that story, that's in chapter 5, we go through chapter 6 and 7. Now let's pick it up in chapter 8. I find this so interesting here. Beginning in verse 1 of chapter 8. Then spoke, now in between here, it records different miracles that Elisha did. If you remember the story about the axe head, the prophets borrowed an axe head, and the axe head fell in the water, and he said, that was borrowed, I'm going to get in trouble. Elisha threw a stick in, and the steel axe floated up. Different things like that Elisha did that's recorded in here. And it's easy to get your mind into some of those things. And I've done this for years when I was reading through. And I started to put this together of the next thing here. It says in verse 1, "Then spoke Elisha unto the woman whose son he had restored to life, saying, Arise and go thou and thine household, and sojourn wheresoever thou canst sojourn. For the Lord hath called for a famine, and it shall also come upon the land 7 years. And the woman arose and did after the saying of the man of God, and she went with her household and sojourned in the land of the Philistines 7 years." So Elisha continued during these years. That's something we don't know. From the time that the boy was healed and raised from the dead, there's different stories that took place. The whole situation with Naaman, different miracles that he performed. I don't believe it was a matter of months. I believe it was years. So a few years went by before this time that Elisha then came and told this woman, where he continued to lodge, there's a famine coming. God is bringing a famine on the land. You have to leave. It's going to be very bad. Go find a place wherever you can. She went to the land of the Philistines, as it says here. Now, picking up in verse 3, "And it came to pass at the 7 years' end that the woman returned out of the land of the Philistines, and she went forth to appeal unto the king for her house and for her land." Now, let's again fill in some of the blanks here. How old do you think that boy is? He was guessing, let's just say 7 years old, from the time that he ran out to the field and said, "My head, my head." Then he was raised again from the dead. There were some years of the healings and the miracles that happened between the end of 4, 5, 6, and 7. We don't know how many years. Now 7 years, 7 more years, so he's at least 14 years old, or somewhere in his teens. He could even be 20, depending on how many years went by. So he's with you're going to see, he's with his mom here. So she came back. She had to just leave her property. They had to leave everything they had to get out of the land. Whether or not the government came in and took over the property, or squatters came in and took over the property, she couldn't just go right back to her land and move back in and clean up. She had to go to the king and appeal for her land. Verse 4, "And the king talked with Gehazi." Now, what I just described in verse 3 is talking about her coming to the kingdom. She didn't talk to the king yet. Her purpose was to go before the king. The king is in his kingdom, and listen what he says here. "And the king talked to Gehazi, and the servant of the man of God." Well, Gehazi got a new job. He was fired working with Elisha. Somehow he got a job as a servant to the king of a king of Jerusalem, or is actually in Samaria. So the king is just talking to Gehazi and saying, "Tell me, I pray thee, all the great things that Elisha has done." And it came to pass as he was telling the king, so he was just saying randomly, "Tell me some of the things you experienced with Elisha. What are some of the things?" The king heard some of the things that Elisha did. He said, "Tell me." He was excited and curious. "Tell me some of the things." And he says, "And as he was telling the king how he had restored a dead body to life, that behold, the woman whose son he had restored to life appealed to the king for her house and for her land." So just as Gehazi is telling the king, because of the king's curiosity, the woman comes into the kingdom, the castle, and is there to appeal right before the king. Listen what Gehazi says. "And Gehazi said, My lord, O king, this is the woman, and this is her son whom Elisha restored to life." So here's Gehazi sitting with the king, and the king's curiosity, "Tell me some of the things that Elisha did." This woman turns the corner and walks in with her son, and Elisha says, "King, that's her. That's the woman I'm talking about." Now, that's quite a coincidence, isn't it? God does not work with coincidences. God orchestrated all those details of her coming in and the king at that very moment talking to Gehazi and this woman coming in. Listen to what happens. My lord, O king, this is the woman, and this is her son, whom Elisha restored to life. And when the king asked the woman, she told him. So the king assigned unto her a certain officer, saying, restore all that was hers, and all the fruits of the field, since the day that she left the land, even until now. And that's the end of the story that's recorded there. This woman came with nothing. She's coming back from the Philistines. Her property is either taken by the government or, as I mentioned, maybe squatters. And because of that moment that God set up, the king was so amazed, he took one of his captains or his officials and said, make sure this lady gets back all her property. And not only just gets her property back, but the 7 years of crops that would have come onto her property, give her all that. So she was set up again. Now, there's no mention of her husband. Wouldn't you think that the husband would be the one taking care of that business? I tend to think her husband died. Remember, it tells us he was an old man. Just as Naomi went to Moab with her husband. Now, her husband died, then her 2 sons died. But this woman was coming back with her son to plead for the property. It's just amazing when you think and can make the connection here that when you think, why would God allow this woman to go through such emotional turmoil to bless her with a miracle child, only to allow her to go through the terrible feelings of losing this child? Things that, as I mentioned, I can't even comprehend for a woman what that feeling is to nurture this child all through several years and then to have him die on your knees. And I'm sure even as she said, did I ask you for a son? Why did you deceive me? She was confused. She was in such a turmoil. It's just so exciting how God saw her state. God saw her heart, and what made her a great woman was her compassion, her care for Elisha, and even to the point of providing a place for this holy man of God, as she said. And God rewarded her. There was a scripture we looked at last week, and I wanted to read this again. It's in 2 Chronicles 16:9. For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro through the whole earth to show himself strong or mighty in the behalf of those or them whose heart is perfect toward him. I believe that defines this woman. He saw her heart. He saw her care. Everything that she did with this child when he died was all showing her faith in God, that she had to get to Elisha. She didn't lose hope and just set up for a funeral. She knew that Elisha, God would do something through Elisha. So her faith in the Lord there, and even to the point that God would allow that kind of suffering, the woman to go through it, which she didn't understand at that time. But in many years later, God used that experience. He took her through it. He restored the son back to life. And he used that experience to prepare the king's heart because he was still providing for that woman. And now she got her property back and all the crops that she needed to provide for her family probably for years to come. So it's just an exciting example of God's provision, but we have to be faithful. This woman was faithful. She was a wonderful woman, a wonderful mother in the way she cared for her son, even to the point of coming back and wanting to go before the king like that to plead for her property. I don't know how old she was. She was probably getting up in years at that point. This property that she was getting would only pass on to her family and her son, and she was preparing or providing for the posterity of her son after that. So I thought that was exciting when I read through that before. It's easy to lose track of the story when you're reading through some of the other miracles, and then you come back to this story again. And I sat and I wondered, why would God take her through all that? It's because of God's provision. There's many things we go through, and it doesn't make sense. where we can get angry and bitter towards God, and some people walk away from God. You can never lose your salvation, but all the blessings of God's continued care, you walk away from it because you're angry and bitter. But to stay close to the Lord and keep trusting him, see how God works things out which we may not know now. Years to come, he's still working these things out for our good, as the scripture tells us. So I thought it was worth talking about this woman. You don't hear about her too much, and it's interesting. Her name wasn't given, but the story is included in Scripture. It's for our learning, it's for our examples, and it's just an example of God's wonderful care for his people. Okay, John.